Okay, so we have gone over the various types of power. Now, gonna have just a relatively quick video actually on some various possibilities for the motives behind the use of power. So we'll talk about some potential underlying motives that we've been able to research and see in these various power games, and we'll also go over just a couple um, individual difference examples for how people who are maybe uh, higher in terms of being more power oriented, how certain behaviors that these people might use to search for power. And so some of the underlying motives here that we see in these games, and so especially in game theory, it seems as though there are three possible or main motives that can pop up here. So the first would be own gain, so maximizing your own payoff. In that ultimatum game, if we're trying to maximize our own gain, right? If we're player B, we might want to um, offer 9 points for us and one for the other person, or for player A, and we're trying to maximize our own payoff, we might say, okay, well, anything's better than zero, so I'm never going to say no as long as I'm giving any points at all. There can also be an underlying motive for joint gain, and so right, so this is where we can maximize playoffs or payoffs for all players combined, even if it's not the best for you individually. So finding a way where in some of these games both players can get points. So maybe we both decide to swerve right in the game of chicken so that we both get some points and we don't crash, or one of us isn't left being the only one to swerve and get 0 points. Finally, there is relative gain. So this is just maximizing the difference between payoffs, or so this stems from a competitive nature, right? Just wanting to do better than the opponent. So kind of the mindset of, I don't care if I lose as long as you lose worse, or I don't care if I win as long as I win more than you. So in the ultimatum game, um, player A, if looking for relative gain, would probably reject anything that's 50-50 payoff or below, right? And so the predominant motive does seem to differ across game. Obviously, this is something where there's going to be individual differences. It's going to differ across people. However, in the majority of these games, what we see is that relative gain, so just wanting to do better than the other person in the game, is typically the strongest of the motives. Some individual differences to point out in power motivation. So just going to go through some possibilities for what research has shown to be various behaviors that those who are power oriented or high in trait like power, certain behaviors of these individuals will be more likely to do. So it's certainly not that, if you find yourself falling in one of these categories, it's not like, oh, you're extremely power oriented or anything like that, right? This is just on average some behaviors that power oriented people will do. So competitive sports, those who are high in power like competition, they like trying to do better than others, trying to get that relative gain, right? And win something. They'll also be more likely to do things like seeking an office in an organizational or a business setting. Will oftentimes buy prestige possessions like nice cars in order to have a presentation of power, right? Through, okay, I've been able to afford this, so I must have that competent aspect that comes with power. And so because I've been able to, do the behaviors that I need to do in order to get the money I need for this car. It's also shows status, which is a part of power. It's also more likely that those high in power orientation will try to go into various professions that allow them to manipulate and influence the behavior of others. So obviously things like being a lawyer pop up for this. Interestingly, psychologist also pops up for this. Not that every psychologist is power driven by any means, but when you're a psychologist, right, you are attempting to influence the behavior and the thought processes of others. So it's certainly plausible that someone who is more um, someone who's looking for more power might you try to be a psychologist for that reason, as well as many other reasons. Well, someone who is high in this power orientation will also try to be influential and convincing in group settings. And so, one possible example of this is the four-person. So, this is a psych and law setting, right? In juries, a four-person is elected. Typically, this is the first person who speaks up, and oftentimes, the first person who speaks up and is trying to have influence over the group is going to be someone who is more power oriented. Um, Also, will be more likely to con others. So this is kind of in line with that manipulative profession, right? We talked briefly about this kind of honesty humility index in that personality or trait section. So those who are doing this would likely be low, have low scores on that index. And those with who are high in power, this power trait would be more likely to test influential tactics, which we'll see here. This is an example of that. So in this study, it was a prisoner's dilemma game, but it was a rigged game. So in this prisoner's dilemma game, they didn't know this, but they're actually just their partner was an experimenter, and the experimenter was either cooperating or competing every time. So cooperating, right, would be in the prisoner's dilemma game. So basically with this rigged game, after a certain number of trials, the actual participant starts to potentially figure out what their partner, who's actually the experimenter, is going to do, right? Because the experimenter is doing the same thing every time, either acting in competition or acting with cooperation. And those who have high expectations, that's the y-axis here. Those who have high expectations should be, if they're cooperating, should be looking to exploit this, right? If the partner is cooperating, should be like, okay, my odds of success here are good. If they're just cooperating every time, I can recognize this and use this to my advantage. On the flip side, there should be low expectations. If the partner or the experimenter in this scenario is always competing, because then there's really no chance to win, right? In the classic prisoner's dilemma, the actual participant would be getting into some sort of trouble every time, right? So the possibility of actually winning is zero. So expectations should be low. And recognizing that one of these two things going on should influence behavior. And what we see is that those who are high in power figure this out. So they figure out that their partner, the experimenter, or whoever they think it is going to be doing this every time, either cooperating or competing. And so they use that to their advantage, either to potentially try to get some revenge here, or to try and exploit the behavior of their partner to get the maximum gain for themselves. And so basically those high in power will just recognize this more quickly. Those low in power are less fast to recognize what their partner is doing, whether either competing or cooperating over and over again. And this makes sense, as those high in power are typically more attuned to strategy and ways to exploit others, right? So testing influential tactics as ways to manipulate and exploit. Finally, here we see that going along that idea of being a four-person, right? Those high in this power are more likely to take action, take initiative, be the one to speak up first. And so this was a really simple study that just showed that. And basically in this study, participants had to do some work, and there was this pretty annoying fan that was there. And so the dependent variable or measure here was who was going to then go ahead and get up to make the first move to turn that fan off. And so as you can see, the percentage is higher. Those who are higher in power were more likely to go and turn that fan off relative to those more low in power. All right, so that takes us to the end of various underlying motives and individual differences for power. Next, we'll get into some examples of how power orientation and striving for power and using power for certain behaviors and things like that can be seen in both scenarios of aggression and violence.